Good afternoon. My name is Jorge Heine. I'm the interim director of the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the launch of this new book, just fresh from the printing presses, from none other than Oxford University Press. We have the privilege of having with us the author, Professor Andrew Cooper, who has come all the way from Toronto, where he teaches at the University of Waterloo for this launch. And we're also privileged to have with us two distinguished members of the Pardee School faculty, my esteemed colleagues, Sanne Verschuren and Rhode, who will be the presenters of the book. But taking advantage of my position, I will also say a few things. Professor Cooper, with whose contributions to the literature many of you will be familiar, is one of the leading IR theorists of our time, with an extensive body of work in the field of IR theory as well as in diplomatic studies, with some 30 books to your name. Is that a fair assessment?
9 single-authored.
Well,
three co-authored, 15 editors, something along those lines.
Very good. He coined the term celebrity diplomacy. And some years ago, we were partners in crime in co-editing the Oxford Handbook of Modern Diplomacy, which some people say is still the standard handbook in diplomatic studies. He has also written extensively on the foreign policy of middle powers. You started in that field, didn't you, middle powers? As well as on the G20 and, of course, on the BRICS, which are all the rage these days, now referred to as BRICS Plus. This book that you see here, the Concertation Impulse in World Politics, is, I would argue, if not Professor Andrew Cooper's Summa, or his capo di lavoro, as the expression goes, certainly his most ambitious. It brings together much of his previous work under one grand theoretical umbrella, namely his insights on global governance, diplomacy, and symmetry, on one of the most significant, yet most neglected phenomena in IR. And as you may or may not know, Andrew Cooper speaks on this not just from his perspective as a very active and thorough researcher and analyst of international relations. He has also worked very closely with none other than former Prime Minister Paul Martin of Canada in setting up the G20. So he has been there, sort of present as the creation, as Dean Acheson would say, in some of the most exciting changes in global governance that we have seen in the current century. So this book reflects insights, from very much the inside of how the machinery of world politics is set up and managed. And here, let me share with you a little vignette that shows, it seems to me, quite clearly the main point that this book argues. Basically, it is about the new and creative ways countries are ganging up to deal with the challenges of global governance at a time when traditional IOs are really failing to do the needful. Diana Mondino is the foreign minister of Argentina these days. And she was asked, even before the new government of President Milei took office, whether Argentina would actually join the BRICS, because as you may know, Argentina applied to join the BRICS. There were some 20 countries who did so. In August of 2023 at the Johannesburg summit, 6 of those that applied were accepted. Argentina was among them. And there was a change of government in Argentina in between. And Mr. Milei had a strong sort of anti-BRICS take on international affairs. So there was some question whether Argentina would in fact accept the invitation or reject it. So Mrs. Mondino says, well, when asked whether Argentina would join or not, she said, I would be happy to entertain the question if only I knew what the BRICS were all about. It's very unclear to me what it stands for. It's not an international organization. It's not based on a treaty. It's not a regional scheme. What is it? So if somebody can explain this to me, I would be happy to look into it. Well, it seems that nobody in the Argentine Foreign Ministry was able to do that. I don't know whether as a result of that or for other reasons. Argentina, in its infinite wisdom and that of the new government, decided to reject this invitation and stay out of the BRICS. But it seems to me that she is not exactly one of the most knowledgeable people in diplomacy. She comes from a very different background. But even so, the fact that she could say this tells you something about sort of the general lack of understanding what these new entities mean, what they embody, how significant they are. People can't sort of put them into one box or another. And in that sense, it seems to me that this book is extremely important. I would argue that this is a book that constitutes a major theoretical breakthrough, conceptualizing the emergence of an alternative to traditional IOs. I am a student and was privileged to be the research assistant to Robert Cohen at Stanford some years ago. And of course, he had a very particular perspective on institutionalism and how international politics works, in contrast to the realist assumption and the realist school. So I was particularly fascinated by the insights that on this important debate Professor Cooper brings to the table. And he does full justice to the role that groups like the G7, the G20, the BRICS play in a rapidly changing international system, capturing their unique features and dynamics and providing fresh insights into our troubled and crisis-prone world. Professor Cooper, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for attending. Jorge is very special to me. I missed him as an ambassador in South Africa, but I caught up to him as an ambassador both in India and in China. We also, of course, spent a lot of time collaborating together in think tank world and editing several books. So this is a real friendship that has lingered. It's a real pleasure to be here for kind of U.S. launch of this big book. I think only because of pandemic I could do 150,000 words and 372 pages, and was probably slip it under the OUP watchful eyes of the editor-in-chief, who I kept saying it was 100,000. I'm sure he knew that it wasn't 100,000. But I have to say Boston is very special to me as well. As a young academic, I spent, 9 months here across the river, working, not working, but with, soaking up theory that now probably I'm criticizing today. And I have to say, my spouse was at Boston University as a postdoc at the Martin Luther King Center, Martin Luther King Jr. Center, as a postdoc counselor there. So she certainly wants me to take as many pictures and see of the architecture, what's changed in BU. But it was a very special time for us as well during that period. You can appreciate kind of young, but you can also appreciate this stage of life, because it's sort of looking back. It is trying to kind of get a bit of a synopsis from what you've done. As Jorge has mentioned, but probably I'm most associated with kind of books, whether they're single authored or collaborative endeavors, kind of trying to push the basics of diplomacy, trying to kind of find cracks or kind of innovative practices. Again, the niche diplomacy in terms of the kind of middle power concept was important for me, and certainly it's middle powers in some ways are back now, so middle powers have never really gone away. Celebrity diplomacy going through the G8, when it was a G8. I've done a book on internet gambling in Antigua. Antigua, a country of 70,000, taking the US on at the WTO. And the big book, the mega book, still, as Jorge has mentioned, kind of not a stellar, but certainly, I think, both
comprehensive, but also the individual chapters, I think, have been very, very well attended. The book I've got here is very different. It's a much more traditional, conventional book. It's going back, I think, more to kind of statecraft rather than what you would say as ornately complex diplomacy. It's going back to a different type of structure, and again, a structure that's deservedly stigmatized, problematized, contested, but certainly you can see that it's present in the 19th century concert of Europe, present in 1919, present in 1943, 45. All of these times you can see the impulse of concert activity keeps coming back. So the puzzle was, why do IR scholars, particularly in the mainstream, particularly in the United States, ignore this? Why do they kind of rule it out? And I guess the basic premise would be that this is old statecraft, not kind of new activity. But I think there's still a puzzle about what fundamental institutions are here. And when I say sort of the mainstream, I mean, we can sort of go through. I mean, certainly Robert Heine, massive amount of writing, mentorship, the work by rational design scholars, Duncan Snidel, and again, lots of acolytes and people that he's mentored, and then off into the kind of what I guess could be called the family of kind of rationalistic mainstream IR neo-realists like Stephen Krasner, and even Eikenberry and others into the kind of liberal internationalism. This is an approach that in many ways is constricted. There's a sense that there's only really two fundamental institutions that are contested with each other. One was probably the preferential one, at least from the literature, even in the mainstream, is kind of multilateralism, to continue to expand and to continue to kind of socialize through the system, versus sovereignty, which self-help, usually denigrated in the literature, and certainly different approaches in terms of national interest. There's a lot of problems. I mean, there's certainly, you can say, wonder whether sovereignty is actually an institution or not. Certainly, I think it's quite hard to see sovereignty as an international institution, but this is usually the duality or the binary that's set up. There's kind of these two choices. What I've tried to do is to kind of try to kind of get a contested view that still is theoretical, because I know with that mainstream US-centric IR scholarship, you can't just have messiness. You can't just have facts. You have to have something that you can put into the place. So I've gone back. I mean, the English school does have some advocates in the United States, but probably much more in the UK. Barry Buzan probably is certainly in terms of Google citations, he's up there with the top US IR scholars. But in Australia, and again, the school, as some of you will know, the School of International Relations at Australian National University, named after Hedley Bull. There's also another emotional connection with me, because Hedley Bull, I knew of him when I studied in Oxford, but his last lecture was at the University of Waterloo, where I teach, a long time ago, 1983, 1984. Quite a sad in retrospect, because I think he did know he was not going to last much longer. But certainly it's a very different sort of encapsulation of his thoughts in this series of lectures that I can sort of come back to at the end of the talk. What is interesting is that this distinction between the mainstream and Bull has been picked up by some pretty big scholars. I mean, it was probably the best example is an article by Wendt and Duval in a co-authored or an edited book by James Rosenell. That really is interesting, because it distinguishes between what they call old institutionalism with Bull versus kind of new institutionalism with Heine and others. But even though it's a very interesting article or chapter, it really hasn't got much play. Certainly in the mainstream, very rarely cited, even though, again, what is interesting to me is some of the quotations from that chapter that Wendt and Duval point out that Bull is much more comprehensive in the fundamental institutions that he privileges. War he sees as an institution. Spheres of influence he sees as a fundamental institution. For me, what is important is that he sees concert as a fundamental institution. Something that countries come together, again, as Jorge has mentioned, almost kind of in club sense, that they concert together, that they can have policy proposals, that there's a degree of, at least in putative terms, of management, global management. And I think this is the real key. There's got to be something that you're trying to set yourself up as a global manager, even among countries that most probably are rivalrous or factional, and so on. And the other aspect of Bull's work, even though he doesn't use the phrase I use, concertation, kind of goes all around it, concerts, condominiums, and in this last set of lectures, concerting with, which is also interesting, in a sense, and points to two types of concerts. One is this pluralistic concert where countries of very different types could come together and try to cooperate among themselves, versus the solidaritist concept of concerts, where kind of like-minded countries come together. And these were probably much more the traditional views, right? Even though certainly 1943, 1945, if you see the big three, as a concert, very unlike-minded countries, but in the 1812, 1814 period, even up into, the terrible sort of Berlin, concert formation about, that really divided Africa up. Certainly there was a like-mindedness in terms of objectives, at least. There's certainly resonance now, because what my argument in terms of practical politics is that this isn't just something from the past, it's something that we have to take into attention now, that concerts is around us. Certainly in the pluralistic side, the G20 is sort of the best example of, certainly from the financial crisis in 2008, trying to come together, trying to manage, trying to work out policy proposals. And then on a solidarities basis, not just the G7, certainly not the G8, but the BRICS as well. Some attempt to try to build on a solidarity motion. So again, this book is kind of animated by frustrations. How come, this whole very sophisticated literature, sophisticated scholars really don't tackle this question. They go into all sorts of other sets of institutions, again, with the anchors of multilateralism and self-help, but they don't really tackle this sort of idea of concertation. And again, this is really what I find intriguing. And also intriguing is that the literature has taken an informal turn. So from Jorge's introduction, saying that the BRICS isn't an institution because it doesn't have a charter. Well, right now, the 21st century, I'm sorry, this is the wave of institutions. Most of the new institutions don't have charters. You can't really find them. You can't know what the headquarters are. There isn't a bureaucratic charts. So certainly this is very much, and the mainstream literature in some ways has adapted to that. But it hasn't adapted to concertation. So for instance, Cohane has weaved and gone all around. He starts off with regimes, which is very informal. Then he focuses on formal institutions, WTO and the UN. Then he goes back to kind of plurilateral state societal, but mostly societal, kind of networked institutions. And at the same time, Duncan Sneidl and Abbott wrote quite a major article in 1998 saying that formality and formal institutions were superior. There was a logic to formal institutions. By 2012 and beyond, they're writing all sorts of articles about informality, but there's never any explanation why 1998, the logic that seemed to be so compelling to them, changed. There's no doubt, there's no kind of retrospective going back and saying, oh, maybe the logic has changed. Maybe there was something we didn't see. They're very self-confident literature. There's never any mistakes. It's just pushing forward and saying we've got a literature and a kind of a rationale for. So again, at least in terms of the main focus, it's this puzzle about why concertation is not taken up. There's no mention of Bull really in this literature. There's no mention of Duval and Wendt. And the only realist that the mainstream really, I wouldn't say likes, but takes account of is Mearsheimer, who's the one realist that really doesn't privilege institutions. But there's a lot of other realists, from Kissinger to Holstein to even Daniel Dresner, who kind of take into account that concerts are important and informality is important. So just to cut down some of the work I've done, 5 real major problems beyond this idea of a lack of concertation. And some of these, maybe questions on them. One is just that they assume stability. They kind of ignore crises. Secondly, there's an inconsistency about whether efficiency or norms really are paramount. They start off certainly with our logic of efficiency, but it kind of gets watered down and diffused over the time. And it's probably the interesting kind of aside for somebody like Robert Cohane is the buying into the idea that perhaps some sort of democracy platform or democracy league or democracy summit would be of great use. Of course, that would be informal, but of course there it's not seen as concertation. It's part of this process of kind of expansion, and kind of quasi-multilateralism. And finally, as we know, individuals are important. I mean, there's something about dealing with prime ministers. There's something about dealing with, certainly the key administrators, the key policymakers in the United States. When you look back at the G20 finance, essentially, this was made at the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C. Paul Martin and Larry Summers sit down and they have a list of countries. And they say, oh, no, the Malaysian finance minister, he's in jail. Malaysia is not going to be in the G20. I mean, what sort of logic of global governance is this? I mean, you can say, well, maybe it's a good thing not to.
Why not Chile?
Why not Chile? Because, I mean, the story there is that they liked the Argentine finance minister, and some say he was a roommate of, somebody that was in the Summers cohort. But that Chile is one of. I have talked to Paul Martin. He says, we should have had Chile in there. So again, it is this sense of, but these are, I mean, again, we can have questions about this, but the real, for the discussion, because I know I don't have time, to get into that. The 2 themes that I will take up to some extent is one, that the United States is at the core of the institutional fabric. And with that, there's a sense of commitment. But if you look at it in institutional terms, you don't see total commitment. You see a lot of convenience. And when you see that, you see the sort of G7 as a pretty good example of this. You certainly see the movement to have Russia in the G8. You certainly see even, as I've said, the G20 finance, perhaps to some extent. Of course, George W. Bush pulling the trigger on the G20 in terms of 2008. Just having kind of off the shelf from the same countries as was in 2000 or the late 1990s. So what is interesting there, of course, is that this is important. You'll have your own views of whether and if Donald Trump will resurface as a president. But if he does, we know concert diplomacy or anti-diplomacy will be at the center of activities. And what is clear, the only thing that is clear about that sort of format is that he has no time for solidarity constructs. If you look at his whole behavior at G7s, there's no kind of sense of loyalty. There's no sense of kind of common purpose. The people that he's most critical post G7s are usually what have been traditionally American allies or friends, including Canada. Biggest liar I've ever met, Justin Trudeau was labeled after the Quebec G7. Macron, I mean, you could go into all sorts of different... Yes, and you see Angela Merkel there, right? I mean, this is not an image of kind of like-mindedness and kind of commonality versus this very, however you want to call it, peer equivalency, where he's comfortable dealing with people, in a kind of a very particular sort of leadership role, or whether it's a transactional style. Again, a lot of debates about this, but certainly it's not fitting this whole notion of committed practices with a multilateralism and so on. And it's not just self-help sovereignty, because we do see activities in terms of this type of summit process. The real one, though, is in the global south and the construct of the US centric mainstream. And here, I think there's all sorts of gaps that really, I think graduate students could spend a lot of time going back and looking at a lot of the literature in the 1960s and 70s and 80s from the mainstream and kind of pulling it together. I think they've been given a bit of a free ride in terms of that their standing has been so great that I think people have been a little reluctant to take them on. But if you look at the global south, or the old third world, there's a question, and this is what Bull comes back. He's got a great phrase. He's quite content with managerial processes, with global management. What he doesn't like is arbitrariness, and this is what he worries about. This is what he worries about the United States and, of course, the old Soviet Union, that these are irresponsible countries. And again, this is quite interesting, this language. And this arbitrariness comes back, and I'm sure some of you have seen this cartoon. This is an update in the context of the Cornwall G7. It's a cartoon that was used in China, it seems, in textbooks in the 19th century about the Great Humiliation, right? The carve up of China, and there's all these culprits, right? The countries that had all these unequal treaties. But of course, the interesting twist in Cornwall is that the British invite the South Koreans, they invite Australia, and they invite India. So there's not just 7, there's 10 countries. So again, they have to have an animal for each country. And we see, of course, this is a cartoon in the Global Times, with every country. Canada gets the beaver, it's probably a little less fangy than some countries. But again, this shows a deep discontent with what the Chinese call small circles, right? This idea that the hegemon or the collective hegemon can kind of divide the world up into having these small circles as opposed to multilateralism, opposed to other forms of global governance. And of course, as you all know, there's at least 2 types of approaches that the Global South could have used. They could have kind of gone back to the Bandung moment, 1955. This was a big moment of kind of solidarity, third world, global south. Or they could have had a pluralistic approach. Cancun, 1981, where you see a whole set of countries almost mirroring the G20, but this is a one-off event, right? This is a one-off process. I mean, if you have Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, there's probably the chances of kind of having a rapprochement with the Global South are not great. And of course, there's other obstacles as well. China's just coming back from the Cultural Revolution. There's all sorts of things, but at least there's an attempt to have that sort of approach. And we can see some sort of replica of this. No one, I think, in 1990 or 1998 or even 2005, 6, 7, would have imagined that you would have had a G20 hosted by Indonesia. I mean, I don't think the Indonesians would have imagined that they would be hosting a global summit, or perhaps even India, or perhaps even South Africa, or perhaps even Brazil. But what we have, of course, is that sort of process. So even though the G20 doesn't get a huge amount of attention in terms of policy anymore, for those countries, it's huge. It's a real kind of coming out that these countries are important, that they're at the center of global governance, and that these countries matter. And if you go to the countries, certainly I went back to Indonesia in November, billboard's still there, right? Indonesia, the host of the G20, almost everywhere you go, you know, this kind of set of credentials. And on the other side, as certainly, even if the Argentines don't know this, we can see that certainly the BRICS Plus gives a vast sort of leverage to the BRICS. Whether it's going back to the Bandung moment, where there's kind of a sense of a larger kind of coalition of countries rather than the kind of vanguard, I guess you could call it, that you saw in 2008, 2009, where you had China, Russia, India, and so on. Of course, Russia is an interesting question because I don't think anybody would see Russia as a global South country, but they've, you know, you can always underestimate the Russian diplomatic skills, and they've done an extremely interesting, significant job of kind of pushing the idea and pushing the notion that they can also be a leader in the BRICS. So to finish up, we can see that I'm not saying that Bull kind of got everything right. This sort of lecture series he did in Waterloo way back in 1983, there's a kind of a sense of a change in his opinion. He loosens up. He kind of admits that the global South has to be taken seriously. But saying that, there's still a lot of gaps. I mean, huge normative gaps on gender, on acknowledgement of just how harsh colonialism was, all sorts of things that you could go in and still criticize them. And even on technical terms, you could deal with that he's really not an IPE person. He's not all that interested in finance. He's not all that interested in sort of technocratic capacity. Whereas again, if you look at the BRICS and the G20, this is one of the aspects that's interesting. Even though it starts as leaders oriented, it does kind of create all of these other sort of networks through think tanks, through academics, through business groups, and so on. And this is sort of one of the fascinating features. So to finish up, you can see that in some ways we've all been armchair academics. I mean, one of my critiques in some ways of the kind of the mainstream US-centric literature is that it is pretty classic armchair academics. I mean, you know, Cambridge, Mass is pretty nice, you know, and other places are pretty nice, but it is a sort of an arm. But I think to give them you know, some more allowance. Again, in the last 3 or 4 years, we've all been kind of, I wouldn't have done this book if I wasn't kind of in a proverbial armchair. But at the same time, I think studying what we're studying, what we're, you know, as academics or as students or as think tankers, we need to kind of look at the world in a different way. And I think we have to go beyond, whether it's kind of in the fields, in the front lines, or kind of, you know, as sort of quasi-insiders. We have to sort of take that world into account. And I think even though Bull doesn't have the answers, it's not a bad starting point to sort of position some sort of concept or conceptual framework, particularly from somebody that doesn't profess to be scientific, somebody who doesn't profess to kind of have some sort of mathematical model or quantitative model about how the world organizes. He's very modest in that sense, even though he's very immodest in the sense that he has a huge amount of confidence that the world will continue to evolve the way he says it will, that it won't be just through the UN, it won't be only just through the IFIs, it will be through war, it'll be through spheres of influence, and it'll be through concerts as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Cooper. And I now turn the mic to Professor Verschuren, please.
So thank you very much for having me today. Thank you very much for the invitation, Ambassador Heine. Thank you very much for the opportunity to read your book, Professor Cooper. It was a great and fantastic read. And so I'll start with a little bit of summary, and then I have 4 sets of thoughts, 4 buckets of thoughts for you. So in this book, you build on the work of Hadley Bull to make an intervention, a debate between multilateralism on the one hand and sovereignty on the other hand, ultimately coming down between a differentiation between these formal embedded international organizations like the United Nations and other less formal forms of cooperation conceptualized under the term concertation. According to your definition, concertation is an institutional format that places the emphasis on forms of dialogue, mutual exchange of information, knowledge sharing, and the aim of unified proposals among competing and even fractious actors. And so while Bull does not explicitly use this term, you kind of foreground it, and contemporary examples as we saw from your presentation include the G7 and the G20. And so I very much applaud your critique of the traditional understanding of institutions within international relations, one that overlooks that deep inequality that is embedded within these institutions, the role of informal institutions, an overemphasis on US commitment to these institutions, and the overlooked role of non-Western countries within them. So I'm going to drag a lot of the examples over to my world, which is the world of armament and arms control, and because that's kind of the world that I know best, but one that also really illustrates, I think, some of the points that you're trying to make. So let's think, for example, there is such a big wealth of formal and informal institutions in that world of armament and arms control. We have big yet deeply unequal multilateral institutions like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We also have kind of more clubby arrangements. Let's think about the P5, which consists of the 5 nuclear proliferation treaty recognized nuclear weapon states. We have institutions that do not feature the big powers. Let's think about the TPNW, the recently adopted treaty against the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Let's think about the cluster munitions ban, the landmine ban. We have formal and informal institutions that are embedded within the global south. Here we can think about nuclear weapon-free zones, and we can think about the non-alignment movement and the work that they did in these spaces. And so we have a plethora of state actors, NGOs, and even corporations, if we think about contemporary debates around AI, around how to regulate AI. And so we also really have these super informal institutions, like the Red Phone between the US and the Soviet Union, the informal conversations that exist between military counterparts or academic counterparts in track 1, track 1.5, and track 2 conversations. And so I'm really impressed by your book and by trying to think and taking seriously all these different forms of institutions that regulate the global order, and in my case, that regulate the security aspect of the global order. And so I really like you for doing that, and I like the book for thinking about the newly creative ways of governance. However, a question I have is, what precisely is concertation? Embedded within your book, there are somewhat different understandings and different concerns with what exactly you mean with concertation. Is concertation the fact that two opposing or adversarial sides are meeting under the framework of an institution? Think US, Soviet Union, bilateral arms control. Or is it about the acceptance and even the formalization of hierarchy? So think about the nuclear haves versus the nuclear have-nots in the NPT. Or is it about the fact that these things are informal? Think about our Red Phone, right? Which of these three elements are really what is driving these forms of concertation, and what are really the elements that you care about, and how do they interplay with one another? And then I also wonder whether the distinction between concertation on one hand and multilateralism on the other hand is really that stark, right? When is something concertation and when is it multilateralism? If I think, for example, what I taught my students on Monday about, which is the Hague Code of Conduct on the proliferation of ballistic missiles, is that a form of multilateralism or is that a clubby type thing? Like, where do we put that on the scale? That isn't always clear. And within that, like even within our multilateral, ideal type multilateral institutions, we get these kind of clubby type things happening. So like in reality, these two forms of institutions are a lot more mixed. Then for my second point, I want to kind of think a little bit about the argument that you kind of end on building on Bull's work, right? Like that continued cooperation is really a necessity in world politics, even between adversarial states, and I think that is right. And in doing so, you're saying that these institutions are continuing to play a central role, but that is not just every type of institution like IOs, but that is specifically the primacy of these consortium type institutions, which for those who were not on the mic before, I asked about the definition of concerted institutions and the distinction between concerted institutions on one hand, multilateralism on the other hand. Okay, everyone's with me. Okay, so within that, and getting these global kind of management things, I have a couple of questions of clarification. So one is, I don't know if you're familiar with Stacey Goddard's recent work on institutions, and she kind of has this point where she has a piece where she's arguing the liberal bias that existed in much of the institution building in the 1990s and early 2000s with this idea of we're going to change China and Russia through these international institutions, and that was the wrong move, right? But then she points to what you actually need is you need to build institutions with these folks, you need to build institutions between the United States and China, and maybe the United States, China, and Russia, right? But how do we do that? What does that look like, right? Like, why would Russia and China want to ever join something like that? I mean, if we think about arms control, almost everything is gone now. How do you rebuild that, and what should that be looking like in a trilateral arrangement? And here, I do think that there's one important thing that's often overlooked in the debates, which is that we often think that you need trust to build institutions, but actually I don't think you do, because if we think about all the big arms control stuff, that got pushed through when the world was at the brink of collapse, right? Like when there was massive distrust and massive, think Reagan, Gorbachev times, right? Like that's when you push through arms control. So anyway, that's maybe something to think about. So I guess this is what the pluralistic side of the organizations look like. But then on the solidarity side of the organizations of the equation that you're talking about, I mean, you talked about Biden's efforts to bring together democratic states. And to me, that seems incredibly inflammatory rather than helpful in easing tensions. So why would solidaristic institutions be a solution to these problems? And why also are we so quick to go back to the language of the Cold War, right? When we're thinking about that relationship with China, we're so quick to go back to all these old tools again. And maybe Bull has an answer somewhere that I haven't come across yet, so I'd be interested in your kind of thing. And then the other tension in the book is also like, are we talking about great powers, or are we talking about structurally important powers? And what are the distinctions between these? So if you could clarify that a little bit, I would really greatly appreciate it. And then we've got your solution and your recommendation in types of these concerted forms of efforts, pluralistic or solidaric, which both of them I think have some, like for pluralistic, what does it look like? For those solidaristic, doesn't that throw fire, what's the American expression? Fire on the fire? No. Fire on the wood on fire, whatever. Something with fire, everything on fire. But at the same time, these institutions are insufficient to deal with truly global problems, right? Like if we think about something like climate change, why would these type of institutions ever help us solve those things, especially when the consequences of climate change aren't necessarily going to be felt by those big powers in the first place, right? Like the first victims of climate change already here is not the global north. So how do we deal with issues that are not about these strategic tensions, but that are about these global deep issues? Okay, and then in terms of a third point, so I want to push back a little bit about, and maybe, I don't know, or I want to open a conversation a little bit about the Global South and its contributions to these institutions. I think that there's really a lot of interesting work coming out right now about like the Global South navigating these deeply unequal international institutions. I'm thinking here, for example, about the work that Mexico and Brazil did in contesting some of the NPT stuff in the 1960s. So Luis Rodriguez, for example, is currently writing articles and books on this. I'm thinking of the work of Jonathan Hunt that's also on these topics of how countries in the Global South actually had a lot more agency in these big power discussions around how to control nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. So I think that maybe there we can talk a little bit more about the additional agency that existed and the additional change that existed on the part of the Global South within these dominant great power institutions historically, beyond the Badung moment and the Cancun moment, but like more these like fine nitty-gritty influences that these countries have had. And then I also want to push back against the notion that the Global South countries are necessarily passive or good citizens of this global order, right? Like if we think about the International Criminal Court and the way in which some African countries are pushing back so hard against the ICC, I mean, that really challenges that notions of them being like just the intakers of whatever the great powers are, or whatever the global institutions are throwing at them. And then finally, just to end on a question that I have a specific interest in, because I'm a student of Mark Blyth and Nina Tannenwald. And so my question, of course, here is, you talk in your book about COVID-19 not giving rise to change or to expected change as much. What are the crises that lead us to change? What are the characteristics in crises that push us towards maybe a worse or a better world, but push us in a different direction? But thank you very much. It was a great pleasure and honor to read this new fantastic book. Recommended to everyone in the room.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Verschuren. And now give the mic to Dr. Rhode. Grant, please.
Yes, hi, everyone. I'd like to thank you, Ambassador Heine, for inviting me to participate, and to Professor Cooper for coming from Canada to be with us today to talk about his new book. And I think it was a very elegant presentation in terms of the logic that you prepared. And I think that the book, if you have a chance to read it, you'll find that the language is elegant in the book as well. It's well worth a read. And he gave a very simple and direct dedication to the book to the scholars and practitioners who taught him to gaze and engage globally. So to gaze, and just that word, this is what we do, is we gaze, we try to take in international relations, and we look globally. So I imagine that Hedley Bull scholarship was one of those influences that taught him during his graduate work in Oxford to gaze widely and deeply, as well as to engage globally. According to the Stanford anthropologist Arthur Wolfe, regarding my graduate mentor in Oxford, the sinological anthropologist Morris Friedman, Friedman would attend seminars, sometimes lean forward, with eyes alight, brows lifted, about to catch an idea that excites in a phrase that pleases. So we have here today in your book an idea that excites in world politics, and a phrase that pleases in the Concertation Impulse. So I've had a chance to, and the honor to teach diplomacy and statecraft here at Boston University. And this is a course really on the history of statecraft and diplomacy from 1815 to the present. So the early foundation of the course in terms of the syllabus examines the concert of Europe in the early 19th century. So the motivation to organize this concert, which you really only gave one slide to, and you don't really go down and dig out the 19th and not that much of the 20th century, but really into the 21st century. So I think the way the syllabus has worked here is that we've maybe done 30% of 19th century, 45% of 20th century, and maybe 25% of 21st century. And your book really pushes forward, and I think going forward will change the syllabus for this course in the more recent period. The balance of power structure that was intended to take Europe out of the wars of aggression and the Napoleonic Wars. 5 great powers involved: Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and later France. That this was the great concert of the 19th century, and I think it was operable and effective really for 100 years, from 1815 to 1914. The big blip on the screen, the biggest blip, was probably the Crimean War. So how the Ottomans got left out of this picture, was a huge issue. And I know we have some Ottoman expertise in the room here. And the devastation eventually came about later in the 20th century, after the breakdown of the 19th century concert of Europe. The syllabus, I think, not only here at BU, but I think in many places will come to be reshaped by your thinking in this book, which, as Ambassador Heine has said, is really a compilation, a distillation of a long period of intense scholarship, many decades. And so this is really a remarkable contribution. So if I may, I'd like to raise two areas in which your comprehensive book, 350 plus pages, almost 400 pages, has raised some questions for me. So that it sounds like maybe I was able to absorb the book a little less intensely than you were and skim through it. But to get into it, the foreword is very useful, and then the table of contents, both with the half a dozen theoretical chapters at the beginning, and then the specific chapters after that are dedicated to examination of the Global South, the G20, the BRICS, as well as this very interesting chapter that you talked about in a slide or two about the personalist, populist disruption of the concertation idea in what you call the Trump challenge. This is also a very interesting recent contribution. So let me say that aside from all of these fascinating examples that you've brought, my first question will relate to the G20, and my second question will relate to a group that you don't give much attention to in the book that I could find in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So regarding the G20, in October of 1922, and I was very happy to see that you brought in slides, and I just found out that you've returned from this intense visit to Indonesia, where the G20 was in October of 2022. And there was a sidebar set of meetings of the R20 at that time, the religious 20, which was very important because really a cultural aspect of the relationships, and there was a lot of discussion about the very important moderate Islam group in Indonesia, the Nahdlatul Ulama, the NU, and there was discussion during that summit in Bali about the following year. It was going to be held in India, the G20, and the topic and the R20 was basically dropped. So this idea of having the tolerant Islam discussion was not that interesting to the next host of the R20. So we have here two great Indonesia specialists at BU, Professors Robert Hefner and Jeremy Menchik, and they participated in these 2022 R20 deliberations. A kind of diplomatic track 2 discussion, in a way, is the way that I looked at it when I heard about it. I happened to be in Indonesia myself at that point in time. This idea of spin-off parts of concert members and so forth is an interesting aspect of concertation, and this is an example of it. So given this example, my question is, how much can highly varying points of view be accommodated in concerts such as the G20, such a large group, especially when they have rotating leaderships, and what kind of trends and momentum can you build on issues? So on the second question about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, would you consider this group of 9 countries in Central Asia, which include Russia, China, Iran, India, and 5 of the stands, to be an example of the concertation impulse? And what do you think of the relative weights of security, economic, and political factors in this organization compared to other concerts? I also, because I'm a China specialist and an Asian focused person in my research, I think about the AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US, so my mind, and you talked about theory, but I think about Mackinder and the Eurasian heartland, and then the idea of Nicholas Spikeman and the Eurasian maritime perimeter, and you have this the continentalists versus the oceanists, or as they say down at the Naval War College, the elephants versus the whales, and you have these but you have these groups, and are they playing off against each other? And just in that region, how ASEAN might fit into this. I don't think I heard you mention ASEAN as well. So I'd say, congratulations on the book, and thanks very much for your talk. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Lots of fantastic comments and questions. If I can sort of go through a few of them. Yes, I mean, the nuclear question, arms are very important. And how do you bring countries into those sort of regimes? I mean, I went to a fascinating seminar on Monday with my friend, colleague, TV Paul, who's got a new book about India, and he interviewed the previous Prime Minister in India, Prime Minister Singh, and said one of his greatest achievements was to end nuclear apartheid. In kind of keeping India out, So this is important. I mean, and you see the sort of the imagery of fairness and equality, I mean, so deeply built, but also kind of, I guess, if you want to say, the spikiness or the prickliness of sometimes the global South. The questions of tactics versus strategical informality. I mean, the red telephone, yes, it's important. And certainly Bull was very conscious. And he wanted more kind of bilateral concertation. He didn't see that as being totally at odds with what was going on. But at the same time, he saw that as very different from these sort of periods of kind of strategical concertation through Concert of Europe, or, again, 1919, 1943, 1945. I think he tried to make a distinction between kind of the things that were done as kind of more habits of practice day to day between administrators, between military people and so on, versus the big state, leaders and so on. And I think this is important. The question of socialization, yes, I mean, I have to say, I need to do a bit more reading about this. But, again, my experience with the Canadian Prime Minister, this was an obsession of his. We have to bring China in before China is too big to be brought in. So even though that was a valuable process, most probably it leaves out all these other options that maybe China doesn't want always to be brought in, certainly on the terms of the old kind of rules that were present at the creation sort of idea, with a very different Chinese government, with a very different, the Raj still in place, all sorts of things that were. And again, coming back to, Mark Blythe and, the crises, I mean, this is another major point. I mean, I got engaged in this because that was the real question. What sort of crisis would bring global governance changes? And we went through all sorts of different sort of scenarios. One, I mean, very interesting to go to Alexandria, Egypt, at the great library and talk about water. But the more people talked about water, the more kind of intricate and complex and technocratic it sounded. I thought, the leaders are not going to kind of come together because of water. But health did seem to be. And this was the real, I guess, disappointment for me, because I always thought that if there would be some sort of trigger catalyst for change, it wouldn't be finance, because there was this great confidence that the finance ministers, the bankers, had it covered right after the Asian/IMF crisis of the late 1990s, that you didn't need leaders to be involved in this. It would be taken care of by the technocrats. And of course, that wasn't the case, but there did seem to be room for the other sort of aspects of symmetry. And this, even with somebody like George W. Bush. George W. Bush, the story went, was obsessed with bird flu. That he thought that this was going to be the major crisis, and this would be something that would be crossing borders, and therefore it would be also something that would be, again, a trigger to have some sort of cooperative practice. And at least in those days, health didn't seem to contravene sovereignty in the way of other issues. I mean, if you look at Chinese practices with SARS, for instance, they brought Taiwan back into the WTO or the WHO in some ways. They were quite accommodationist. We've moved a long way, and unfortunately, maybe in a downward spiral from COVID and so on. Moving into kind of the big geopolitical aspects. Again, there is some sort of language that we can see that maybe could have been used as a domestic analogy, even though Bull didn't use the word concertation. Somebody else, again, along the lines of Mark Blyth, Robert Cox did. Concertation was a very apt phrase for him. He could make the analogy work of what was done particularly in Western Europe in the 70s, early 80s, in terms of tripartism, corporatism. I mean, he could see this. Bull, I don't think, knew enough about domestic politics to kind of make that leap, and was always very suspicious of kind of domestic. He did kind of siphon domestic, but there's a lot of other things, and of course my colleague Eric Heine has done a lot of that sort of work, right? Kind of what word, I wouldn't say dredging up, but I mean going back to the archives and looking to see what different countries did and what different actors, even individual actors from so many different countries did in Bretton Woods and so on. And it's a very different story, particularly, of course, the Latin American story, that's very important. So certainly there's all of these things. And on the other aspect of geopolitics, I think Russia is very, very different from China in this regard. China is an experienced concert power. In fact, the more concerts for Russia, the better. I mean, it's the only country that I could have imagined that could balance being in the G8 and being in the BRICS. I don't think any other country. And one of the sleight of hands, because I tracked this very closely, there was a whole process of outreach with different countries, that were going into the G7 and G8 and kind of meeting for kind of half a day or a day on the sidelines of the G8. And of course Mexico was involved with what became the BRICS. And then all of a sudden, just kind of mysteriously, Mexico was jettisoned and Russia came in. And without much publicity from the other countries, but a huge amount of publicity from the Kremlin, saying, oh, we've had this meeting in Japan, of this kind of new grouping, Russia kind of convenes it, et cetera. And of course, this is really historical, right? I mean, Russia likes this sort of, and again, I don't know if historians would say, that my analogy of Trump and Alexander I, but what writing about Trump, I figured I had to use some sort of history. I mean, who in history can I kind of equate him to? And I mean, that would be the only person. Obviously Alexander I had a lot more religiosity. He had been on the battlefield, but certainly in terms of their kind of style, there's a lot of similarities, between this and the disruptive style. And again, it shows that deep kind of penetration of concertation. Ottoman Empire, I'm a bit more unclear about. I mean, I do know that I believe they were in the Berlin, conference. So certainly in that regard, you can see them as a concert power, even after those kind of early decades or so of the kind of very European-centric. Which comes to the final point is, I think this is one of the, successes that, again, US-centric academics don't give much attention to. The opening up of all of these other countries, as I said before, Indonesia and so on, into kind of concertation in a way that you would never have imagined. Shanghai Cooperation, I think it's a very different. I think there was some sort of ambition in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but now it just seems to become a kind of a fairly pro forma event with a bit of competition between the Russians and the Chinese, and also with the sense that there's balancing off. I mean, it shows a certain diplomatic skill to bring Pakistan and India both in to that type of organization, where India is always, is always placed in a very difficult position because it doesn't have those regional neighbors that it can bring in as kind of outreach groupings. I mean, if you look at the G20 and the BRICS, one of the really enlightening aspects is that it's like some sort of kind of social event. You're allowed to bring your friends in. The problem is India doesn't have all that many friends, you know, at least close in hand. So it always strikes me about the gaps in your own knowledge, because of course what you find is that India scrambles around to find some sort of regional grouping that doesn't have Pakistan in it. So they can have the regional grouping but not have Pakistan. So the Bay of Bengal, you know, that I have to say I'd never heard of before, but all of a sudden, you know, at the BRICS summit, they invite these countries from the Bay of Bengal because of course it allows them to have an outreach grouping that doesn't have Pakistan. So all the intricacies of this. And then finally, ASEAN. I've just done another piece in global policy comparing ASEAN kind of informality to quadrilateral security initiative informality. And what, you know, and again, ASEAN scholars I think might push back on it. I find a lot more formality within ASEAN than I would have expected to find. You know, that it's got a kind of a culture, yes, of informality, but when you look at it, again, a little bit more closely, there's, you know, a semblance of a secretariat, there's a semblance of a charter, there's a semblance of fairly, you know, clear timelines for meetings and so on, where the Quad has nothing. I mean, it's totally informal. I mean, this, in some ways, if that's the new model, it's going to be very helter-skelter model of you know, international organizations, because you really don't know who's in, who's out. Australia could kind of move out for a while, come back in. You could have other countries coming into the Quad. You could, you know, I mean, lots of, you know, very, very extreme informality. Like you really just don't see anything that's kind of set or kind of transparent in a way that you would see. So it's a long way away from the traditional IOs that we were brought up studying, right? The UN, IFIs, you know, maybe the GATT and the WTO. These were the IOs. We come in a very different world now, you know, very different world.
Absolutely.
Very good. So, please, go ahead.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I haven't read the book yet. I can't wait to read the book. You have two boosters that make me want to read the book even more. So I guess I guess one of the questions that I have is really about who, or I guess which state or organizations benefit from the informality that you're talking about, and perhaps even the ambiguity. During your talk, I kept thinking about, because you mentioned spheres of influence, and I was just started thinking about all these French international lawyers in the late 19th century who became incredibly critical about the idea of spheres of influence as well as protectorates, arguing that it could undermine the international system. And in that case, the French lawyers argued that it was the British who benefited. And related to that, I was thinking about efforts to codify international law in the 19th century, and who's pushing for codification. It's oddly Russia, and of course the United States, which didn't have nearly as much power in that period. And also the Ottomans were always pushing very much for clarity in international law and pushing against ambiguity in every possible way. And I guess that led me to think too, so the question is who benefits from ambiguity? But then related to that, I have a second question, which is just thinking about Wilson and Wilson's critique of secret diplomacy, that this is the real problem and how we got into this mess. And so I'm wondering if the Wilsonian critique is actually part of why we don't talk about concertation, because I completely agree with you that if we look at the interwar order that was created out of the mess of the First World War, what do we see but a kind of recombination and reconfiguration of imperial era institutions? Like if we think about the League of Nations and how the management of refugees, drug control, human trafficking, all of those institutions are reconfigurations of, you know, the old concert era world. So I'm wondering to what degree Wilson is part of our problem, I guess. Thank you.
Very good.
So to go back, China's always in a very difficult position. I mean, if you go back, I mean, as you know, to the period, 40, 45 up to 70, 71, I mean, China was, of course, the main critic of the UN. A gang of gangsters. Cabal of this and that. Because of course they were on the outside. So once they got into the UN Security Council, this is a very privileged position. But at the same time, it made them very cautious for informality. I remember this was, really interesting Chinese academic / think tankers / kind of policy insiders kept saying, we've got what we want. We're comfortable with it. We don't mind the G20 finance. We learn a lot. It comes back to the socialization. It was that period, with WTO where you would have with CAS in Beijing that had, 500 experts on the WTO, all kind of pouring over everything. I mean, unbelievable. But the problem then is, okay, how do you adjust to something else that comes along, like the G20 of leaders? Do you elevate it? It's very contested for the Chinese because they always have to go back to this kind of one step into the G20 and then one step back, that we're not moving away from the global south, we're not moving away from multilateralism, we're not moving away from the UN. So the documents, and certainly in the, when China eventually does host the G20, it's very, very cautious, in terms of that language about informality and about concertation. They accept it. We've gained status, but it's also sort of this balance with the other kind of commitments that they have. Russia has none of those problems. I mean, and again, your point about Russia during COVID, I mean, my understanding of Russia is that they were the most formal, country during COVID in the UN Security Council. They wanted everything in person. They wanted everything as it was. They didn't want any of this kind of tactical informality. No Zoom calls for the Russians. I mean, everybody else is kind of moving around and doing things. They are 19th century in that sense. And that point about legality. I mean, maybe it seems a bit odd to kind of think of the Russians in that sense, but they think of themselves in that sense. But it doesn't mean that they can't operate in different spheres. I mean, they can operate formality and legal in one and then kind of go and push. They were the real, even though Lula gets most of the credit for the BRICS, I think the Russians really were the Primakov, big thinker, right? I mean, just out ahead of everybody else, in terms of geopolitical strategy. I mean, quite.
The first summit was held in Russia.
Exactly. And not many countries have that big strategic thinking, that somebody or a few people kind of just sitting there and putting the pieces together and kind of, okay, how do we do this? And then with the UN Security Council privileges, they can have meetings on the side in New York. They can do other things. A lot to get into, and again, that leaves out the Turks and the Ottomans. But that's an interesting about where you see yourself in the world. I mean, there's kind of objective analyses of countries and there's subjective analyses. And now, to me, as a kind of a student of these kind of hierarchies, there's some countries that seem to be very comfortable with the fit where they are, including, I think, Indonesia. Maybe this is going to change, but it always strikes me that Indonesia is the most comfortable country with where they are. A big country, they could be dominating in various ways, but they don't. They're kind of a middle power in a sense. They put the privilege on ASEAN. Yes, if their turn comes around to host or be the president of the G20, but they don't jump up the line like the Koreans do. The Koreans are edgy, right? I mean, I've done a lot of work with the Koreans about the middle powers, but I don't believe that any Korean really thinks they're a middle power. They all think that they're moving up. It's like grade inflation. Canada used to be like this. I mean, Canada in 45, 50, I mean, you call them a middle power, but you weren't giving them a C minus. I mean, they thought of themselves as a B plus, A minus country, and I think Korea is the same way. I mean, just because they say, oh, we're a middle power, they're not content with a C or a B minus, you know, in terms of a grade. They think of themselves as maybe not an A plus like China and other countries, but they're not too far. And as long as they're ahead of the Japanese, they're really happy. And in some ways, in terms of their nimble diplomacy, they were ahead of the. I went to the Pittsburgh G20 summit in September, 2009. And the Koreans they had adverts in the Pittsburgh newspapers saying, welcome to the Korean G20. And the Korean G20 hadn't even been announced yet. But I mean, this sponsored by Samsung, sponsored by, I mean, incredible public diplomacy that races ahead from the Indonesians and from other countries. I mean, a completely different role in the world. Whether it's backed up by structural capacity is a different question, but the thinking is there.
It is.
Indeed.
Andy, let me push you a little bit on one issue that, stepping back a little bit, here we have the BRICS, we have the G20, so the extent to which they are solidarist or sort of pluralist entities is very much at the core of your categories. Now, John Ikenberry has just published a piece in the January issue of International Affairs, in which he talks about three worlds. And he says, we have, the global West, and we all know what that entails. We have the global South, and we know what that entails. And then he said, and now we have the global East, and that is China and Russia. So his argument is that nowadays, a bit like in the 50s and 60s, there is a contest between the global West and the global East for the hearts and minds of the global South. This is very provocative. I don't, agree with that way of positing the current world situation. But I'd be keen to have your perspective, because obviously, if that is the view, the BRICS in some ways shouldn't exist.
I mean, we all change our views. We're all uneven, and we kind of are a bit opportunist about things. But what I do find very disconcerting is these mainstream US academics who kind of put themselves in a different level than everybody else, that somehow they know what the world looks like and how it's evolving. Eikenberry, if you look back to his previous work, Russia was going to be brought in. The G8 was the biggest success in terms of, it's the only time he ever mentions the G8 is in terms of Russia being brought in. And this is one of the great successes of the post-Cold War. I mean, this is somewhat equivalent to the great creation of 1945. It's the only thing he acknowledges. There's no crises in the 90s. There's no reference to IMF. There's no mention about the G20 finance. It's only the fact that Russia is brought in. So again, you kind of wonder about their explanation for their change of views, because the core is very, very firm, right? But it's more firm than it used to be, because Eikenberry would argue in the past that this US-centric system would expand, that everybody would be brought in eventually, except the kind of hardcore recalcitrant countries. A bit like Stephen Krasner too. I mean, this was kind of trade union stuff, that the hard nut trade unions would be recalcitrant, but everybody else could be brought into this order. That's changed, even though it's unclear whether Eikenberry would know what the global South is. I don't know if he would. I mean, there's a lack of curiosity about the global South. I mean, that's being kind, I think, lack of curiosity about the global South. So what is the global South for him? I mean, I think what he puts most emphasis on, again, are the countries that are kind of picked off quite successfully by the the Western-centric order, you know, and South Korea is the perfect example, right? OECD, a real authentic OECD country, a country you go to Korea and every hotel has a picture of what it looked like in 1951 and now what it looks like. You think, wow, this is, you know, success story, you know, I mean, no question. But on the other aspects of the global South, I wouldn't think that he would be able to contribute too much. I mean, what would he know, you know, in terms of how Brazil is thinking about global, or India, or South Africa? You know, I don't think, so I think it's very difficult for somebody like that to kind of have this big map. I think it's better and safer for him to kind of stick to what he has been doing before this sort of article, is saying, yes, there's a core US-centric Western order, limited but firm. And maybe there's still some credence to that, particularly, of course, with Russia-Ukraine, that maybe the Western alliance has become, in some ways at least, even firmer now in terms of, you know, arms, you know, GDP and so on. But I think once you step out of your comfort zone, it's very difficult to be taken seriously, I think.
Okay, any more questions? Perhaps I would like to leave the word to our presenters. Sanne, something you would like to add?
Sorry, that was a little. So I actually want to pick up on Amy's question, the part of what they're getting out of it. So it seems like a lot of what you answered and a lot of what the example with the Ottomans and the examples you picked on were all about tradition, right? About countries wanting to see themselves in a certain light, about having done things in a certain way. But then there's also the other side of it, which is opportunity. Mm-hmm. What are they getting out of it, right? Like Korea engaging as actively if you do it, if I put like, again, my security lens on, I mean, that makes sense given where they are at and what they're facing, right? So just thinking through that a little bit more, like what's the opportunity part of this?
I think, I mean, that's why, again, I was intrigued by TVs, because, I mean, he puts it all on status. Mm-hmm. And I think in some ways that is a huge research agenda, right? All of these different components of status, you know, nuclear power status, being in a G20 status, quality of life status. The question is whether you can kind of connect what you're doing internationally with what you're doing domestically. And sometimes, and again, India is a pretty good example, the status in the world seems to me kind of racing along where domestically, yes, probably there's going to be another majority government in India, but there's still some sort of underlying freesias there. I mean, the idea of the religious 20 is a pretty good example of that, right? I mean, if you really can't pull off that type of, I guess what some countries would think is status, that you can kind of build in some sort of societal component. And of course, that's been the Chinese Achilles heel as well, because during their G20, of course, they didn't want to tackle a lot of the kind of civil society 20 or the, you know, the more, the non-state components outside of the B20. So, I mean, these are all going to be very, very difficult questions for those. But state is also in sort of regional terms, you know, coming back to Turkey and to other countries. Is it a good idea to kind of raise your status regionally beyond the measure of other countries, you know, where you're expected to be kind of represented? I mean, Jorge was in South Africa. I mean, you've seen this, you know, firsthand, right? The South Africans, it's a real burden in some ways, where for other countries it might be seen as a really good thing to say, okay, you know, you're in a privileged position, you have infrastructure, you have good technocrats, you have this and that. But for South Africans, it is a burden, right? I mean, the more they say they're the kind of representatives of South, you know, of Africa, the more African countries are going to be, you know, seeing that maybe they should have other representatives at the table. And of course, this is why the African Union breaking into the G20 is such a big deal, right? It takes, it's such a good thing, you know, because it takes the pressure off the South Africans as this kind of representative. I mean, nobody would say India is a representative of, you know, pick your, you know, the subcontinent, you know. I mean, and you know, but South Africa has had that issue, and of course with that, what do we do when all the other kind of reforms are stalled? You know, I mean, really does go back to the Bull conundrum. You know, he sees the UN, I think, in very exaggerated way as a pseudo institution, because he doesn't see it as kind of fundamental. He doesn't see this as an institution that would be kind of reproduced century after century. He sees it as very time specific, right? 1945. So maybe now we're getting into the period, you know, if we can be pessimistic, that the UN has sort of run aground in some ways, that, you know, that we're not going to be taking the UN as seriously, at least as the central organ. Maybe the specialized agencies are a different thing, but central organs doesn't look a very pretty picture from COVID and beyond COVID. You know, so I think we're going to have to take that. If there's a gap, and this comes back to the opportunities. I mean, if we don't have a view of the UN in the same way as we used to have, then there's going to be a substitute. There's going to be a gap that gets filled by other institutions.
Absolutely. I'm afraid we're running out of time. Unless you have something to add?
Well, maybe I'll just shortly say we come around to talk about AUKUS at all, but you know, part of my thinking is that in these concerts that are setting up, that maybe the AUKUS is more organized in terms of a program than the Quad is, but that it's really a representative in a way of what I have come to think of as an overly securitized approach to concertation on the part of Eikenberry and his Western cohort. So that in terms of the next 10 years, the next 20 years, is that where is this big bloc going to stand vis-a-vis geoeconomic possibilities? So, you know, and to look at the way the concertation takes place in the Global South, winning the hearts and minds of the Global South, if there isn't a geoeconomic component, there's not a whole lot there that the Western Bloc is offering. So anyway, this is something that is the U.S. and Europe going to respond in some way to the BRI that's effective. They have some ideas, and the Global Gateway is one of those, but it's still a small fraction of the effort that China is putting into it. So, yeah.
A really good point.
Okay.
And to show there's a public diplomacy connection with this. I went out to the ISA, you know, and hadn't been for 5 years, and it's you know, a 3-ring circus. So I needed some relaxation. So you go back to your room and you turn on TV. AUKUS is doing commercials on CNN. I mean, it's the first time I've ever seen, you know, that they're advertising the technological sophistication and this kind of like-mindedness. Yes, that's what they had. It was quite
big image. Yeah.
extraordinary. So now I'm expecting BRI to be, you know, some sort of equivalent, you know, sort of. Yes.
Very good. Please join me in thanking our speakers.